2026 FI Formula 1 World Championship, as we going obviously to the second fourth of the season. The gloves are really off, as that coveted Formula 1 Drivers' Championship trophy is really there in the horizon. So the gloves are off and the drivers are really fighting with it the best they can with these all new, all innovative, the super innovative, we should say, Formula 1 2026 machines. So here we will tell you everything about, why we've gotten within a risk of winning this race. Again, the victory is such a long time coming, and why once again it could have been Lewis Hamilton instead of Charles Leclerc, who's mostly leading the way for Scuderia Ferrari in this very, very exciting team battle. Charles Leclerc against Lewis Hamilton. Why it would be the 7-time world champion, who just like when he won the sprint in China, in Shanghai last year, why he could have gotten his first Ferrari victory, and why he probably should have gotten. So you've seen obviously what happened during the sprint, but most of the main contenders finished, and obviously for us finishing 5th and 6th, that was disappointing, right? Then again, when we went, for the qualifying, we knew that it was very, very important to qualify ahead. But it was actually, reading the conditions and being competitive, on relatively cool temperatures. That was the key. And of course, staying out of the trouble and being reliable on this power-hungry circuit. That was the key to winning the Canadian Grand Prix. So over here for the qualifying, I thought we did pretty well, but it was clear, that Hamilton had significantly more pace than Leclerc, who always, try to kind of say why exactly that is, what was the main issue with it. So obviously he talked about, for example, using the different, maybe a brake bias, for example. So we try to fix the brakes on a Leclerc's, car, or is it perhaps using different differential, especially coming out of that turn 7, that I myself, struggle, no matter if it's in, the old or the new 2026 fashion. It was a struggle for Leclerc, but Hamilton was absolutely flying. No wonder. Obviously, Michael Schumacher has won in here 6 times. Hamilton actually won here 7 times, in his career, and his maiden victory, has come on this circuit. Of course, you probably remember back in 2007, right? So we were, of course, expecting a lot, and the qualifying, we progressed well. But of course, in qualifying 3, Hamilton, did actually, have a bit of a big snap, coming out of the turn 7, where he was actually usually mega ass. For example, his old nemesis Verstappen said after the race, and that really cost him the chance, to maybe be even on the front row, or definitely be on the second row. So once again, it was Russell just a whisker from Antonelli looking up the front row, and then having McLaren's, line up 3rd and 4th with the world champion Norris leading the way from Piastri. And Hamilton was this time ahead of Verstappen, Hadjar, and Leclerc only in 8th. So obviously, that was a bit of a disappointing qualifying. But yeah, with Hamilton, we could have easily been, in a P3. Obviously, he, did make a mistake. And with Leclerc, we already, highlighted the issues that really didn't come away, during the race as well. But boy, what a race, this was. So the weather really has kind of thrown a lot of the uncertainty into it. And you can see, sometimes how a little, how a gamble that might have looked good 10, 15, 20 minutes before the start of the race, look absolutely silly when the red lights finally went off, and they took probably the longest in history to, go off. So lots of different tire sets, obviously, being used, different tire compounds. So lots of the front runners were on the softs. Usually, the people who were, in a midfield, some of them were running the mediums, but a lot of them, 7 cars, if I counted it correctly, started on the intermediates, including both orange McLarens. And it was clear, as as you can see, we're kind of experiencing a heat wave everywhere now, on Earth. In Canada for, this time of the year, obviously being still kind of in the middle of the May, it was still, relatively hot, relatively warm. So even though there was a little bit of a drizzle, the track wasn't greasy, it wasn't really declared wet at all. It was actually quite dry, almost bone dry. So it was very clear already from the formation lab, like Piastri was saying, that they were on the wrong tires. And of course, what didn't help them and what really played into our hands, but sadly we were starting, from the 3rd row, so it would kind of prevent us from challenging the McLarens, which would be another way to win this race. You could have told that, us obviously, the more time, because the drizzle really, the rain really stopped, so the longer it took to finally get the Canadian Grand Prix started, the more at a disadvantage the orange cars would be, which was great for us because it effectively put them out of the way. We had these very, very long 5 lights. They came out, but Arvid Lindblad, the only rookie on the calendar, putting in great performances, out qualifying his teammate Lawson. He couldn't get out, of the neutral into the first gear. So obviously, the start was aborted, and we actually had to do extra formation lap. But then because, due to the nature, as we described, of the circuit located on Ile Notre Dame in Montreal, or we should say the Montreal, right, in the French accent, there are just a few run-up zones, and basically, the marshals were unable, to just push the car into the pit lane, so he was effectively out of the race, but they had to push him all the way down to the end of the straight, and then, out of the way, so the cars had to do 2 formation laps. When the 5 lights went out, Norris went into the lead. On the intermediates, Piastri struggled. Hamilton did a great job, going around the outside and then inside of his competitors to line up right behind Russell, who lost to Antonelli. So again, you can see, huge title fight already happening there. But obviously, with Norris leading, it was very clear, that the intermediates were the wrong tires. So everybody, including Lance Stroll, the home hero, he wouldn't even start the race. On the intermediates, he immediately went to the pits and basically changed, to the soft compounds. And so did the McLarens. So they were out at the end of lap 2, and then the real battle between the Mercedes-Benz started, and Hamilton was right behind Russell and had a great opportunity, but you can see how difficult it is, to make the move late on the brakes, right? There were a couple of instances when, for example, Piastri, when he was fighting through the field, he really tried to go heavy on the brakes, took out the Albon completely out of the race into the hairpin. You can see that it does require different approach to overtaking, and of course, sadly for Lewis, he was unable to put himself in between the both Mercedes-Benz cars and then drop a little bit after a few laps. But not before Antonelli almost ran into the back of George Russell. You can see, the gloves really were off over there, because I believe, the really terrible management by the Toto Wolff and, the senior figures at Mercedes who, tried to manage the drivers, right, instead of not understanding that it is a high pressure situation and obviously you're fighting for a championship. Of course, there should be some rules, right? So here, Antonelli, again, being bit on the outside, heading into the final chicane, looked up, almost collected Russell. Sadly for us, didn't, because that would have pretty much guaranteed us the victory, because our only competitor was actually the Red Bull of Verstappen, who made a good use of the overtake button, just like Hamilton did. But once, the Mercedes cars developed a gap of about 2 or 3 seconds, Hamilton did not have the overtake and sadly got overtaken by Verstappen. Maybe it took him a bit of a surprise that Verstappen just took the inside into the turn 1, and that was a real pity, right? I was a little bit disappointed with Hamilton because Red Bull were not really on the pace, but at least, he was able to keep up. Leclerc was also fighting with Hadjar, so it was like Ferrari against the Red Bulls, but it was really the Benz fight, that to me has stolen the highlights, and it's shown, that both of them are not world champions, right? Which is not the case at the 3 other top teams, where obviously you always have a world champion pair with a non-world champion in the form of obviously Hamilton, Verstappen, and Norris, respectively. Then going against Leclerc, Hadjar, and Piastri, respectively. Both Andrea, Kimi Antonelli, and George Russell are not world champions, and that's why they both started making mistakes when they were running up front, right? They couldn't separate each other pretty much, so whoever was running first couldn't create a gap of at least a second. So it was a very pulsating fight for about 30 laps, and everybody started on the softs, right, especially the front runners. But because the tire compounds are really harder than what they used to be, for example, last season, it was possible to run them for almost half of the distance, which pretty much just guaranteed the one-stop race. But nobody was stopping up until lap 30, where maybe one of the first big moments in the championship happened, but not before. You had so obviously Russell, Antonelli, he was, leading there, but once Russell overtook him, after Antonelli almost collected him, Russell made few of the mistakes heading into the chicane, and eventually, I believe it was on lap 22, Antonelli finally overtook, Russell, and did look like a faster driver, but then made the same mistake Russell did, locking up into the chicane, which gave, Russell again the opportunity to fight him very hard. They pretty much touched like this way, banging the wheels, at over 300 kilometers per hour. hour, even though obviously you usually run out of the battery at the end of the long back straight, so it might not be that fast, but still, at that speed, it doesn't matter if it's 270 or 320, you will be flying, a little bit of a touch. But Mercedes again went on the radio, told Antonelli, who had to take the avoiding action, cut the chicane, so Russell obviously he wouldn't go like Russell, who was who hanging out on the inside a little bit like Piastri did kind of against Hamilton, just in the opposite positions. What basically happened is that they told Antonelli to return the position, and you can say that he was really upset about it, but eventually he was able over here to get Russell to establish himself as the leader. After all, he is the championship leader, and this is a huge concern for George Russell, because we expected him to be very strong over here. But yeah, this is actually great for our championship as well, because again, with Antonelli not even being 20, being the only teenager to be leading the world championship, and well, of course, of winning it, frankly speaking, after what happened on lap 30, there is still a great chance for us, especially from June, when the new updated directives to the regulations will come into effect. It could be a hell of a championship. We all definitely hope so. And guess what? George Russell ran into a huge trouble. Basically, all of his power unit shut down on the lap 30, so he had to retire. Really angry, which of course promoted Verstappen to the second place, Hamilton to the third, Leclerc to the fourth. So great points for us over here, and for the first time this season we could actually be the top scorers as a team, right? Because Antonelli will now be collecting 25. We at that moment were collecting 27. Of course, with Russell retiring, it was up to Antonelli to, bring the car home. But you can see Norris also retiring with power-related issues, even though we believe it was the gearbox when he was running like 8 or 7. So Mercedes definitely bad on the reliability. Ferrari running really well, because, Ferrari never smokes, just like our famous founder Enzo Ferrari said. But, I have to say, that we have to make sure that we are a bit more competitive. But, I think we've made good steps forward, but it will be really interesting after Monaco to see what the pecking order is, because it's changing quite a lot compared to Miami. And Hamilton made a bit of a mistake behind Verstappen, so there was a virtual safety car, the VSC, when Russell obviously had to just stop by the side of the road, that allowed everybody to get in their pit stop. And on the mediums, Hamilton then did a fantastic job, reeling in his old nemesis Verstappen, and I think it was a real pity that he got overtaken by the Red Bull villain, because he would have been then behind Antonelli, and Hamilton genuinely was lapping at the same pace, maybe even faster than Antonelli. And if you push Mercedes-Benz to the limit, just like the two drivers did themselves, it will explode, as you can see. So that was a great chance for Hamilton to collect the unprecedented 8th victory here at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, which of course, if he wants to win the 8th Formula 1 title, he should definitely have done. And yeah, it was great to see, the battle on lap 62. Hamilton has finally, been able to get really close, almost, kissing, hugging, touching the wall of the champions, and then, overtaking, a lucky champion, Verstappen around the outside. Everybody, including us, we were really celebrating. Great move, well deserved, second place. He kind of showed Antonelli how to make that move, well executed. But again, we shouldn't have been fighting with the Red Bulls, but second place, that's again great. Leclerc, almost got collected by Hajar, who again showed, just like Red Bull always, fights us so hard. And I really don't understand why the Red Bull always feels the need, to break the rules, the defensive rules against Scuderia Ferrari. Very reminiscent what Hajar did to Leclerc, at over 300 kilometers per hour, to what Verstappen did to Raikkonen, I believe in 2016 or 17, when he did the same on the Camel Straight, of course, in Belgium, in Spa-Francorchamps. Again, here Leclerc was able to avoid him, then he overtook him, fair and square. And of course, given his struggles, he finished half a minute down on Hamilton. Maybe somebody else will also finish half a minute down on Hamilton. It wasn't a great weekend, but great for the damage limitation, because in the championship we are just within pretty much a win and a non-podium of Russell, because Leclerc is now, as you will quickly and very shortly see in the Drivers' Championship, 13 points, behind George Russell. I believe Hamilton, is, if I'm not mistaken, then 16 points behind. And with Monaco coming up, this should definitely be our track, especially Leclerc's track. Russell still, we consider him to be the main threat to the championship, getting ahead of him, and hopefully seeing Antonelli falter, even though it's great great to listen to the Ferrari's national anthem. It feels like Michael Schumacher is winning when the Italian national anthem is playing with obviously the German one, just like the wrong order. But Antonelli, wow, his first 4 career victories came successively. It's absolutely amazing, totally deserved. I believe he was a fast driver, and I have to say, if as an Italian he wins the title, I mean, the future is his, and probably he will be heading into Ferrari, because probably Ferrari couldn't resist, right? Having Italian, especially overall champion, driving for Scuderia. But yeah, he's driving for Mercedes. They kind of keeping him on a leash, kind of mismanaging him a little bit, but because Russell is running into a lot of the technical problems, and of course because Antonelli is able to push Russell, this has thrown a completely new dimension to this amazing 2026 championship. So I hope you guys enjoyed the race and this fantastic race reaction. Now let's turn around the Scuderia Ferrari Red Retina iMac to see how the race finished. Okay. So over here, I hope you guys can see it very, very nicely over here. So winner of the race over here, sponsored by Lenovo, obviously, the spin-off of the IBM that we used to work for before, which is now one of the title sponsors, featuring especially on that super rotating Macarena wing that really makes sure that, we still have a good, decent speed, down the straights. They definitely help us. They did help definitely, Hamilton to get the second place. Andrea Kimi Antonelli in the end won by 10 seconds from Hamilton, who, just hounded down Verstappen after losing out to him and overtook him. That was really, really what we wanted to see from Hamilton. So his strongest race, his best results for Ferrari. You could see he was beaming after the race. So Verstappen finishing 3rd, Charles Leclerc 4th, but you can see, 33 seconds down on the 2 fighting world champions. Obviously, I think Leclerc, he has shown a fantastic attitude, especially like my beautiful wife Angel Amy said, that he really takes responsibility for maybe his inability, to be good on the traction, to be good under the brakes, which is key over here to mastering and doing well at Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Leclerc has never really done very well here, and you can see that him coming from Monaco, right? He's really, and because he's a true Monegasque, right? You can see, that great royal education where you have to be a true gentleman, and basically be honest with yourself instead of blaming everybody else, especially the car. Like for example, Verstappen is always doing, great attitude that I believe will make Leclerc world champion. But again, there are a few tracks that he really needs to get better at, Canada being one of them. 5th then Isaac Hadjar, but 1 lap down. Obviously he, best result of his Red Bull career, but of course with McLaren's out and Russell out, maybe this position flattened him a little bit. Same like for Franco Colapinto, best results of his Formula 1 career and for Alpine, 6th place, but 1 lap down. 7th Liam Lawson. Obviously Arvid Lindbergh will be sad because he could have been, probably, 6th himself, or maybe even a 5th ahead of Hadjar, who's collected so many penalties. Again, erratic driving by him, but Lawson, great job finishing 7th. 8th, Pierre Gasly, Alpine. He really needs to make sure he doesn't lose his number 1 stages to Colapinto, who's outperformed him here once we are in Americas again, where Colapinto is from, obviously being from South America, in North America, and of course very close to the Central America in Miami. Colapinto was flying, not so Gasly. 9th, then Carlos Sainz for Williams, scoring 2 points. 10, Oliver Behrman, scoring a point over there for Haas. So let's take a look over here. Now, how does the Drivers' Championship look like? So, obviously, we've given you the sprint table, so we don't need to go over that. But this is the 2026 Formula 1 Drivers' Championship, and Andrea Kimi Antonelli has taken a massive step towards becoming, by far the youngest driver in the Formula 1 history to be crowned the world champion. 131 points. It will be interesting before even turning 20, I believe, what would that do for his career, right? George Russell stays at 88 points that he had after the sprint, and that's a massive gap of 43 points, almost 2 race distances. Obviously, as you can see on these wonderful calendars, we are going to go to Monaco and Barcelona next, and Antonelli is almost guaranteed to lead. He only needs, because Russell's only won 1 race, Antonelli 4, he actually only needs a 7th place, which should be a walk in the park for Antonelli, at only one of the races to be leading after Barcelona. That is the scope of that gap. But Charles Leclerc being third, only 13 points behind Russell on 75 points. This is exactly what we need. But that gap to Antonelli is very, very concerning, right? So we will see what happens, because this might be the last time that the Mercedes powered cars have a clear advantage over us, maybe the whole season. Again, from the 1st June, the compression ratio of the pistons in your internal combustion engine is gonna be down to, I believe, 16 per second from the 18 that we believe the Mercedes and probably also Red Bull powered cars, with the Red Bull powertrains AK4, are running, which obviously Ferrari is not. Ferrari completely legal, which we absolutely love over here. So it will be interesting. They will definitely lose some of the horsepower, and we are pretty much now only losing on the main straight. That's why we are so optimistic heading into the Monaco. There are no straights, only the corners, which we are dominating. That's right. So, again, it can change a lot, and Leclerc is actually much closer to Russell than he would have even thought. And of course, if Antonelli starts faltering, which we kind of expect given his tender age, this could be Leclerc's year, or could it be Hamilton's year? He's only 3 points, can you believe it, behind Charles Leclerc, 7-time world champion on 72 points. And, that must be concerning to Leclerc. He's really gonna win in Monaco. Hamilton, despite being a 7-time champion and big Senna's admirer, he actually hasn't done that well in Monaco over the years, so probably it will be very tough for him. But a Ferrari 1-2, would be sweet there, and that would then be the second race in a succession that we collected the most points, which could also put us back into the play for the Constructors' Championship. The reigning world champion Lando Norris dropped down to 5th for McLaren, where he kind of should belong with 58 points. 6th is then Oscar Piastri, McLaren, 48 points. Very botched race for him. And 7th, Max Verstappen, Red Bull getting his first, maybe on the last podium, maybe of the whole season or for a long, long while. 43 points over there. You can see, the scale of the Red Bull problems, just how far over he is. 8 is Pierre Gasly, Alpine, again collecting good points. He's on 20. 9 is then Oliver Behrman, has 18 points. 10 is Liam Lawson, Racing Bull, 16 points. 11 is then Franco Colapinto, Alpine, 15 points. It's surprising that he's got so many points. But yeah, he's done well in Miami, collected a couple of points here, and especially in Canada. And wow, look at this, only 5 points of Gasly. That's a huge turnaround and almost cements his place on the Formula 1 grid for the foreseeable future. 12 is then Arvid Lindbergh for the racing, Isaac Hadjar for the Red Bull Racing, 14 points. So obviously 12th place there for Isaac Hadjar for the Red Bull. He's now on 14 points and made a breakthrough, getting 10 points for the 5th place. So kind of shaking off his bad luck, but you can see his erratic driving cost him maybe a chance to fight Leclerc for 4th, who was a bit off the pace. Carlos Sainz is now the unlucky 13 for Williams on 6 points. 14 Arvid Lindbergh, he should have gotten many more points for Racing Bulls. He could have almost doubled the tally, but again he couldn't even start the race, so he's on 5 points. 15 Gabriel Bortoleto, Audi, 2 points. 16 Esteban Ocon has 1 point. Again, Behrman scoring points, Ocon being nowhere. That's a huge concern for him. We will see what happens in Monaco. 17 Alexander Albon, PS3 completely destroyed his race. You can see how not such a significant tap of the tire into the side pod right of the car can completely put you out of the race, because took out all the radiators, so it immediately overheated that Williams car. He's on 1 point. Then we have 18 Nico Hülkenberg, Audi, still pointless on 0 points. 19 Valtteri Bottas, Cadillac, 0 points. 20th Sergio Perez for Cadillac, 0 points. 21st is now surprisingly Lance Stroll for Aston Martin on 0 points, because Fernando Alonso 22nd, Aston Martin didn't finish, and now Stroll has finished higher than him. I'm not sure exactly, if it was a 15, 16 position where Stroll finished, but, that's basically how it's counted down. So that will be interesting, because Aston Martin Honda looks like they will be collecting no points. And wow, Alonso finishing last in the championship. Should he continue, 45 years old? Make your vote down in the comments below. So this is the Drivers' Championship. So let's take a look at the Constructors' Championship for the 2026-2026 season. And you can see Mercedes, the first team to get into 200 points on 219. But we are Scuderia Ferrari are on 147. Of course, that means that we are 72 points behind, which, is again, we could catch them, after Barcelona, but they are almost guaranteed to lead after Barcelona. But if again, because this was the first weekend Grand Prix, that we scored the most points out of any team. So if we can definitely do that in Monaco, I would definitely bet on that if I was in that lovely casino that you can see me taking the picture in front of for my very iconic the YouTube profile photo. Again, we have a chance, and we should definitely, try to fight for the Constructors' Championship, but the gaps look big. So that's a bit concerning after only technically 5 races. McLaren on the third place on only 106 points, so that's great that we have the gap to them, and I believe they won't bother us, much anymore, because they will also be affected, obviously, so the Mercedes engine will get weaker to conform with the regulations. For the Red Bull, 57 points, 5th is Alpine, 35 points, 6 Racing Bulls, 21 points, 7 has 19 points, 95% courtesy of Oliver Behrman. 8 is then Williams, 7 points, 9 Audi, 2 points, 10 Cadillac, 0 points, 11 Aston Martin, 0 points. So this is how the table Constructors Championship looks like. This is how the Drivers' Championship looks like, and this is, of course, how the race has finished with Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Wow, look at this, the Italian anthem. It's so great to listen to it. Feels like the Formula One is where it belongs. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this race reaction. Absolutely exciting race over here. Maybe we were robbed of a bit more of a Benz battle. That could have been another, maybe the last play that we could have won, that they would have simply crashed, but that Russell retirement took away that possibility. But I was really pleased with especially how well Lewis Hamilton has done. That's exactly what you need him to do, to push Leclerc to the championship level, because again, nothing is lost. And remember, there are still incredible 17 races to go, and we can't wait to celebrate some victories, right? Which we wanted to celebrate at Autodromo Internazionale Enzo Edino Ferrari. So, as you know, this is the first Grand Prix weekend that's different from last season. So round 7 was the Imola Emilia Romagna aka the Ferrari Grand Prix, of course, not the Canadian Grand Prix, which is round 10. So, we will definitely go ahead and, you will see it here on the YouTube, when the 10th race, comes around, which will be the Austrian Grand Prix, and you will see, if, I will be able to beat Lewis Hamilton, maybe for a victory, so stay tuned. But yeah, I also, just like Leclerc, finished 4th, had to apologize, that was a really, disappointing race, for me, because, I put it on a pole position, obviously, Imola bowing out of the calendar, really wanted to win it. I'm still having a really good lead in the championship, but yeah, it is concerning that, we were sitting ducks, on the straights. But sometimes in losses like these, as I put it in a race reaction, you can learn a lot, especially how to defend, because you definitely do have to change your driving style. You can't just run with almost no battery, which definitely cost me on that back straight, in Imola. And, perhaps the setup was wrong, perhaps obviously only doing that one, pit stop was maybe not exactly ideal, because I was running out of the tires and made, that mistake coming out of the Tosa hairpin, right? You could ask the Mercedes bonds coming out of or even into the hairpin, but especially out of it, can be very challenging at some of the tracks, like Canada, like Imola, right? Both named after Ferrari legends, because you do need some real skills to get out of that hairpin. So yeah, apologies to all of my Scuderia Ferrari fans, but we are leading the championship, so we are going to go now to Monaco. I've never won in Monaco, so hopefully we will plant it on our second pole position there, maybe even chase the second fastest lap, but actually at least, to get a points finish, to at least, get a podium finish, victory would be absolutely amazing. That would break our hoodoo. It's only Monaco and Azerbaijan, Baku we haven't won, but hey, we haven't even been on a podium in Monaco. At least in Baku we were, and we haven't even gotten on to the points. So, any point from Monaco would be a big bonus. So wish me good luck with that as we try to expand our beautiful collection of these shiny Formula One Grand Prix winner trophies. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed both the virtual and real Formula One. This was Jan, the Smiling Sun Champion, reporting over here from Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in our wonderful, very fashionable Formula One 2026-2026 Scuderia Ferrari fashion. And now, all I can say is that we love racing, we love Formula One, we love Ferrari, Forza Ferrari!